The sonar lit up like a nightmare. Hundreds of shadowy shapes circling the tiny boat, but they weren't sharks. They swam upright in the black water, moving too fast, too unnatural. A flashlight beam caught a pale face pressed under the old dock, eyes unblinking, watching and mimicking. Beneath the frozen lake, a child's shoe floated up through a hole and a whisper called a name. Caleb. These aren't just fishing trips, they're true horrors from the deep. 3 fishermen, 3 nightmares. Which one breaks you first? Don't blink or you'll miss the terror that's coming. Story 1. The Thing Beneath the Dock. The first time Ethan saw the face under the dock, he thought it was his own reflection staring back at him from the water, until it blinked wrong. The cheap flashlight trembled in his hand, its cone of light cutting through fog and catching a pale, swollen face staring up through the gaps in the rotted planks. Features warped but unmistakably his. Same scar on the chin from a bicycle crash at 12. Same tired lines around the eyes, same uneven nose. Only the eyes were wrong. They were too wide, too bright, and locked on him with a hunger he'd never seen in a mirror. The mouth was already smiling before his had time to move. For a few seconds he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The cold night air burning his lungs as the face below floated motionless, hair drifting in the black water like lakeweed. Then, somewhere beneath his boots, the dock exhaled. A slow, wet sigh that rose through the wood, and he realized with a prickling horror that what he was hearing wasn't the lake, but something breathing. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan hadn't believed in anything he couldn't touch. He believed in the heat of an argument, in the slam of a door, in the sound of his wife's suitcase wheels bumping down the front steps. He believed in the way a house that used to feel full could suddenly echo when one person stopped talking. The day he signed the final divorce papers, he'd sat in his car long after the lawyer's office closed, staring at the parking lot lights bleeding in the rain on his windshield, thinking how quiet it was going to be. Willow Lake was the first place that came to mind when he thought of away. His dad had taken him there as a kid. Cheap motel, gas station hot dogs, early mornings on the water while fog still clung to the trees and the rest of the world felt asleep. Back then, the dock was solid, the water clear enough that you could see bluegill flickering beneath. His dad had told him there were good lakes and bad lakes, and Willow had always been talked about like it was one of the good ones. Once when Ethan was 8 and too impatient to sit still, he'd asked his dad what made a lake bad. And his dad, who never joked about much, had just stared out over the water for a long time before saying, "Some lakes don't give things back." Ethan had laughed then, sure it was a spooky story. 20-something years later, through the haze of a failing marriage, he'd forgotten that conversation completely. The morning he went back, the sun was still below the horizon. The highway had been empty, just him and the humming of worn tires and the occasional shape of a deer caught in the headlights at the tree line. His cooler rattled in the back with a 6-pack, some stale chips, and a tub of worms he'd picked up from a 24-hour station. He'd almost forgotten there used to be a proper bait shop near Willow Lake until he saw the faded sign. Gus's, tackle and live bait, half its bulbs burned out. The parking lot was more weeds than asphalt now. Something about the place being there, still clinging on when his life hadn't, made him pull over. Inside, the shop smelled like damp cardboard and old coffee. Dust lay on some of the rods. A small TV in the corner played weather with the sound off. Its screen tinted a strange green. An old man behind the counter looked up as the bell chimed, his eyes squinting like they had to adjust not just to the light, but to the sight of another living person at all. "Heading out early?" the old man said, voice more observation than question. "Yeah." "Willow Lake," Ethan replied, grabbing a pack of hooks he didn't need just to have something in his hands. At the name, the man's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Huh. Don't stock that lake no more. Ethan forced a chuckle. Fish don't know that. The old man studied him for a long moment, gaze flicking to the cooler in his hand and then to the car visible through the glass door. You going alone? Yeah. Just need some peace and quiet. Plenty of that out there, the man muttered, turning to a shelf behind him. His hand hovered over dusty cartons before picking up a tub of night crawlers that looked fresher than the rest. Take these on the house. And if you hear anything under the dock, you don't go looking, you walk away. The warning was so oddly specific that Ethan laughed again, but it came out thinner. What, raccoons? The man didn't smile. Something like that. Driving away, Ethan told himself the guy was just weird, maybe lonely. Still, the words stuck, circling in the back of his mind as the road narrowed and the trees drew in closer. By the time the cracked asphalt gave way to packed dirt, fog had begun to roll low over the ground, curling between the trunks like smoke. When he pulled into the familiar clearing, the lake looked smaller than he remembered, hemmed in by pines and oaks that pressed right up to the shore. The dock reached out into the water in a crooked line, boards darker from years of rot and weather, one corner sagging where a post had shifted. He stepped out into air that smelled like wet leaves, old wood, and something else underneath, metallic like pennies held too long in a sweaty palm. The world felt muffled. No distant hum of boats, no laughter from campsites. Even the birds sounded far away. Gravel crunched under his boots as he walked down to the water. Each step onto the dock made it complain in a long, low creak that vibrated up through his legs, as if the structure wasn't used to holding weight anymore. At the end, he set down the cooler, threaded a worm onto his hook, and cast out into the still, dark water. The bobber bobbed once, then settled. He exhaled slowly, shoulders loosening for the first time in days. Out here, there was no split mortgage, no unread texts, no silence when you rolled. Over at 3 a.m., just mist and water. It took him longer than usual to notice that the water wasn't reflecting the sky properly. Gray clouds overhead should have made the lake a dull mirror, but when he looked down, he saw only an uneven sheet of black broken by faint ripples. A thin, iridescent film clung to the surface in places, catching what little light there was and bending it into sickly rainbows. He told himself it was some kind of algae bloom or runoff. The float drifted lazily, minutes passed. He shifted his grip, feeling the worn grooves in the rod handle where other anxious fingers had rested. The first tug came so gently he almost thought he imagined it. Just a small, deliberate pull, not the quick, impatient nibble of a small fish or the heavy, dragging weight of something big, but a single testing jolt that traveled up the line into his hand like a question. He frowned, tightened his grip, and waited. Nothing. He reeled in, expecting to find the worm gone, maybe stripped by some clever fish. Instead, he stopped halfway, the line suddenly resisting with a little jerk, like it had snagged on a branch. With a little more force, it came free, and he brought the hook into view. For a second, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The worm was still there, skewered and writhing weakly. But through the pinkish flesh, something white jutted. A long, slightly yellowed shape with a curved top and a hollow at the center. A human tooth. It had been pierced cleanly by the hook near the root. A smear of fresh-looking blood clung to it, a bright, obscene streak against the metal. His stomach lurched. A laugh bubbled up and died in his throat. The tooth swung gently, tapping against the sinker with a tiny, crisp clink. The lake, which had seemed so still, emitted a single thick bubble a few feet out from the dock. It rose, broke the surface with a soft, popping sound, and released a little puff of that metallic smell. It didn't sound like gas escaping mud. It sounded like someone exhaling underwater. He stood there longer than he should have, line dangling, eyes locked on the tooth. Eventually, he forced himself to act, yanking it free from the hook with more force than necessary, and flinging it into the water where it vanished without so much as a ripple. "It's just some sick prank," he muttered to himself. "Kids, old rumor, whatever." Saying the words out loud didn't make them feel any more solid. Still, he rebaited the hook, because that was what you did on a fishing trip. You cast again, and sent the line arcing back out into the black. This time the tug was not gentle. The rod jerked so hard it nearly flew from his hands, the force of it dragging him a full step toward the edge. The reel screamed as the line spooled out, cutting a diagonal path under the dock. Ethan swore, planting his feet and leaning back with all his weight. Whatever was on the other end pulled with a strength that felt impossible, like hooking the bumper of a moving car. The old boards beneath his boots groaned, nails protesting in high, strained whines. His arms burned, muscles shaking as he fought to keep hold. Then, just when he thought the line would snap or his shoulder would dislocate, all tension vanished. The rod flew backward, nearly smacking him in the face. He stumbled, caught himself on his knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. The dock seemed to hum under him, a low vibration that made his teeth ache. As he sat there trying to steady himself, he heard it again. That wet, dragging inhale from directly beneath him, followed by a rumbling exhale that tickled his palms through the wood. He didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to get up, to walk calmly but quickly back to shore, to pretend this never happened. But some stubborn, terrified part of him needed to see, needed to know if there was some logical explanation. A log, a trapped animal, something he could name. His fingers fumbled for the flashlight, knocking it against the cooler before closing around it. He clicked it on, the beam weak and yellow in the gray light. The first pass over the board showed nothing but rotted wood, old nail heads, and flecks of moss. He edged toward a gap where one plank had warped away from its neighbor, shoulders tight, and angled the beam down. Eyes stared back at him. They were the exact same hazel as his, ringed in red, set in a face that hovered just below the surface. The skin was swollen and pale, the kind of white that came from being too long in cold water, with a bluish tinge along the lips. Hair floated around it, dark strands fanning like weeds. For a moment his brain tried to tell him it was a body, some poor, drowned man caught under the dock, but the face was wrong in a way he couldn't name at first. Then he realized it wasn't just a person, it was him. His own features stared up at him from the water, warped by ripples. The scar on the chin, the mole near the jawline, the slight crook of the nose. The more he focused on the details, the more perfect the mimicry became. Its lips moved, forming the same half-whispered curse he'd just breathed, a fraction of a second delayed, like his reflection had learned to speak but hadn't mastered timing. The light shook in his hand, clattering softly against the board as the beam jittered over that awful, almost face. He jerked the flashlight away on instinct, gasping. In the darkness under the dock, something shifted, wood creaking in slow complaint. His heart hammered so loud he could hear it in his ears, a frantic drum. "No," he whispered to himself. "No, no, no." He forced himself to look again. When the light found the gap this time, the face was closer, pressed up so hard against the underside of the planks that the nose mashed flat, lips spidering out, smile stretched too wide. Teeth, far too many teeth, gleamed faintly, row after row, like a predator's jaw had been grafted beneath his familiar human mouth. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't even seem to need to. They only widened in delight. The dock shuddered as something heavy shifted beneath it. The boards under his knees bowed. He scrambled to his feet, the flashlight skittering from his grip and rolling toward the edge, its beam careening wildly, slicing across cracks between the planks. In one brief slice of light, he saw fingers, long, pale, bloated fingers curling up from below to hook over the lip of the dock. The nails were blackened and soft-looking like shells left too long in the tide. Water streamed off them in slow, thick rivulets dripping through the boards. He bolted, boots pounding wood, the dock shrieking with each frantic step. Behind him he heard the groan of straining nails and the splinter of giving wood, as if something was hauling itself hand over hand along the underside, staying with him. As he neared the shore, a hand shot up through a gap in the planks just behind his foot, fingers splaying wide, scraping deep grooves into the damp wood where his heel had been half a second before. Cold droplets of lake water spattered his calves. He didn't stop to look back. He launched himself onto solid dirt, knees almost buckling with the sudden change in firmness. The air felt different here, less thick, as if he'd stepped out of an invisible bubble. He ran up to the truck, fumbled the keys twice before finally getting the door open and slammed it shut behind him. For a long minute he just sat there, hands locked on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the dock. The fog had thickened, swallowing its far end. He could just make out the dark shape of it shifting slightly, like something below was testing its weight. On the drive home, his mind tried to rearrange what he'd seen into something reasonable. A hallucination from lack of sleep, a trick of the light, a body caught under there that happened to look like him because he was primed to see himself in any face. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd almost convinced himself. Almost. That night he dreamed he was underwater, not drowning, breathing. The world above was filtered through a lattice of boards, lines of light cutting across his vision. He looked up and saw his own boots standing on the planks, heard the faint jangle of keys. When he reached up to touch the underside of the dock, his hand was pale and swollen, fingers bending in ways they shouldn't. He pressed his face to a knothole and peered through, watching himself stare down, eyes wide with horror. The joy that flooded him from the other side of that gaze was so pure, so sharp, it made his chest ache. He woke up with water in his throat, coughing so hard tears streamed from his eyes, the taste of lake muck on his tongue. In the bathroom, the mirror was fogged as if someone had just taken a hot shower, though the room was cold. He wiped a hand across it and froze. For a split second, his reflection didn't move with him. His hand stopped, but the hand in the glass dragged on another inch, leaving a streak through the condensation before catching up. He stood there, heart pounding, staring himself down until his vision blurred. For days, little things piled up. He'd find faint, wet footprints on the hardwood between the front door and the hallway, too long and narrow to be his, with toes ending in small dark commas that might have been nails. The doormat stayed damp even when the weather had been dry. At night, the pipes made new sounds, slow, rhythmic knocking that wasn't in time with any faucet, a soft gurgling on the far side of the bedroom wall that stopped the moment he held his breath to listen. He started leaving the bathroom light on just to avoid catching himself in the mirror unexpectedly. A week later, when he reached for his truck keys hanging on the little hook by the door, his hand closed on empty air. He checked the coffee table, the kitchen counter, the pockets of every jacket he owned. He went out to the garage twice, convinced he must have dropped them near the workbench. Nothing. He called his ex-wife, grasping for any excuse. "Did I leave my keys over there?" he asked, hating how hopeful he sounded. "You haven't been here in months," she said, her voice flat. "Are you okay, Ethan?" He hung up without answering. He used the spare set to get to work, told himself they'd turn up. They didn't. 2 weeks passed. Every night the dreams dragged him back under the dock. Every morning his eyes looked a little more tired, the skin under them a little darker. He stopped sleeping for more than a couple hours at a time. One Saturday he finally remembered the cooler still sitting in the bed of his truck, untouched since the day at the lake. The sight of it made his stomach twist. He'd been putting it off, not wanting to face the stink of old bait and melted ice. But now it felt wrong to let it sit there any longer, like ignoring a closed door in his own house that something whispered behind. He climbed into the truck bed, fingers tight on the handle, and flipped the lid. A wave of cold, foul air hit him, sour and metallic. There were a few empty cans rolling in slush, a plastic bag of unidentifiable gray mush that might have been hot dogs once, and on the bottom, half submerged in an inch of murky water, lay his keys. They were rusted along the edges, the once shiny metal dull and pitted. The plastic fob had swollen and split, wires peeking out like veins. The little fishing lure keychain, a gag gift from his wife on their first anniversary back when she thought his weekend hobby was endearing, was twisted into something unrecognizable, the metal bent inwards as if clenched in a fist. When he picked the keys up, cold water ran down his wrist, seeping into his sleeve. On the flat side of the largest key, etched in ragged, uneven lines as if scratched by something that had never held a tool before, was his name, Ethan. He dropped them back into the cooler with a splash. For a long time he stood there, listening to his own breathing and the faint drip of water from the keys onto the plastic. Logic tried to assemble a scenario. He'd thrown them in there that first day in a panic. Someone had found them at the lake and decided to play a sick joke. But none of those explanations accounted for the way the metal was warped, for the freezing temperature of the water, for the letters that matched his own shaky handwriting from childhood when he'd first learned to spell his name. That night he didn't even try to sleep in bed. He sat on the couch with the TV on low, some wildlife documentary flickering in and out of his awareness. Sometime after midnight, between a scene of salmon leaping upriver and an ad for car insurance, the screen went black for a heartbeat. In that moment he saw his reflection, his own face staring back at him from the glass, but the mouth was smiling, teeth just a little too sharp. Then the documentary resumed, the moment gone, leaving his heart racing and sweat cooling on his skin. He told himself he wasn't going back to Willow Lake. It was the one firm decision he clung to. He even started looking at apartments in another town, somewhere without so many bodies of water on the map. But as the days went on, he found his thoughts circling back to the dock, to the feel of the boards under his hands, to the way the breath had vibrated through the wood, to the eyes that looked like his but didn't belong to him. The more he tried not to think about it, the stronger the pull became, like a hook set deep in his chest being reeled in from far away. It wasn't any one thing that finally broke his resolve. It was a combination of small, cruel details. The bathroom mirror fogging over in the middle of the day with the word "come" traced faintly in the condensation, letters vanishing when he blinked. The sound of dripping continuing even when he'd turned off every tap and checked every pipe. The night he woke up choking and realized his pillow was damp, the side of his face pressed into a cold patch, his hair wet as if he'd fallen asleep in the rain. He found himself driving the familiar route almost without deciding to. The highway blurred by, trees and mile markers and the occasional gas station sign slipping past the edges of his vision like scenery in someone else's dream. When he passed Gus's bait shop, the parking lot was empty, the windows dark. The sign out front had lost another letter. Now it just read G.S. He thought about stopping, about forcing the old man to explain, but his foot stayed on the gas. By the time the idea fully formed, he was already on the dirt road, the washboard rattle of it humming through the steering wheel. The fog was thicker this time, rising from the lake in slow coils that wrapped around the trees and drifted across the clearing. He parked, closer to the path than before, some animal part of his brain already planning his escape route. The air smelled wrong, heavier, like something had been left out too long and had just started to turn. The dock looked worse. One of the posts had cracked near the base, causing the last third of the structure to sag closer to the water. Boards had buckled in places, leaving jagged gaps. As he stepped onto it, the whole thing responded with a shuddering creak that rippled out like a wave. Each footfall sounded amplified in the stillness. He didn't bring a rod this time, only the flashlight, brighter and heavier than the first, and his phone, though he wasn't sure who he thought he might call. The fog muffled his footsteps, swallowing their echoes. Halfway down the dock, he paused and listened. The silence was so complete it had texture. Then, very faintly, he heard it. That slow, dragging inhale, as if the lake were drawing breath. "Okay," he whispered, though he didn't know who he was talking to. Himself. The thing below. The memory of his father saying some lakes don't give things back. He crouched near one of the wider gaps between warped boards and angled the flashlight down. At first, the beam only illuminated murky water and the slick side of a post, green with algae. He swept the light slowly left, then right. "Come on," he muttered, not sure if he was hoping to see something or praying he wouldn't. On the third pass, the light caught an eye, then another. They appeared out of the black like coins reflecting the beam, unblinking. The face followed a moment later, rising into the light. It was closer now, as if it had been waiting just out of view, and he'd snapped a leash by calling it. The skin was less bloated than before, the features sharper, more defined. The resemblance to him was even stronger. Wrinkles at the corners of the eyes matched his exactly. There was a faint shadow of stubble along the jaw. "Why me?" he whispered before he could stop himself. The lips below moved. This time the voice he heard didn't echo in his head. It rose from the water in a wet, bubbling murmur that still somehow sounded like him. "You came back." His heart stuttered. His first instinct was to deny it, to say he hadn't wanted to, that something had made him. But those words felt dangerously close to an admission. Instead, he swallowed hard. "What are you?" The smile widened. The teeth multiplied. Where there should have been a neat human row, there were layered points like the lake itself had grown a mouth. "Hungry," it said, and in that word he heard more than just appetite. He heard emptiness, old and patient. He jerked the flashlight away, breath coming in fast, shallow gulps. Underneath him, something scraped along the length of the dock, an oily, dragging sound. The boards dipped, rising and falling as whatever was down there shifted its weight. He should have run then. Some part of him knew that. But the questions he'd tried not to ask tore free. "How did you get my face?" The breathing intensified, the intake louder, rattling the boards. He risked one more glance. The face was pressed so tight against the planks now that splinters dug into its cheeks. Water trickled from the corners of its mouth like drool. "You left it," it murmured. "You cast it. I bit. Now I wear it." The words made no sense, but at the same time they fit in some horrible way. He saw, in his mind's eye, the first cast of his line into the lake, the worm wriggling, the barb glinting in the low light. The thought of something down there swirling around, tasting that offering, not just the bait, but the tiny flakes of his skin, the sweat from his fingerprints on the line, made his stomach turn. A hand rose from the dark, fingers fishing blindly between the boards. They found purchase on either side of a crack and pulled. Wood groaned. Nails shrieked as they were wrenched from soggy beams. A sliver of the dock tore free, splashing into the water. He staggered back, nearly losing his footing. Another hand appeared, then another set of fingers further down, like it had too many limbs or didn't quite understand how many it needed. The dock lurched, tipping slightly. He spun and ran, the flashlight beam swinging wildly, throwing crazy shadows. The boards bucked under his feet. Behind him, water exploded through widening gaps, spraying his legs. He heard a sound like a laugh, distorted and gurgling. The last 10 feet felt like a mile. He hit the shore at a full sprint and didn't stop until he was at the truck, chest heaving, vision tunneling. He dove inside, slammed the door, and locked it, hands shaking so violently he could barely get the key into the ignition. Through the windshield, he saw the dock shudder one final time before settling. The fog swallowed its far end, leaving only a suggestion of shape. He drove home in jagged bursts, speeding, then slowing, checking the rearview mirror as if the lake itself might be cresting the hill behind him. By the time he pulled into his driveway, his knuckles were white on the wheel. For days afterward, he moved through life like a ghost. Work, grocery store, the hollow rituals of existence. People asked if he was okay. He lied. At night, he thought he heard water moving in the walls. Once, taking a shower, he closed his eyes under the hot spray and felt the temperature plunge to freezing. When he looked down, the water running off his body was dark, flecked with bits of sodden wood. In the steamed-over mirror afterward, someone had drawn a simple shape in the condensation, a long rectangle jutting out into a circle, a dock on a lake. He tried to move away. Packed boxes, looked at rental listings in cities far from any significant body of water. But each time he made a plan, something went wrong. The apartment he wanted went to someone else. His car wouldn't start the morning he was supposed to go sign a lease. An unexplained leak appeared in his kitchen ceiling, a spreading stain that smelled faintly of algae. The plumber he called crawled into the crawlspace, then backed out 5 minutes later, face pale, insisting there was nothing wrong with the pipes and refusing to go back in. One night, unable to take the not knowing any longer, he set up his phone on a tripod in his bathroom, aimed at the mirror. He turned off the light, left the room, and sat on the other side of the door in the dark, listening to the quiet recording. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Just the faint hum of the fan and his own breathing from the hallway. Then, so soft he almost missed it, he heard a single drip. Another. The sound grew like a sink left slightly on. On the recording, there was no click of a faucet. When he played back the video, his fingers numb, he watched condensation slowly form along the top of the mirror, gathering until it was fully fogged. Then faintly at first, lines began to appear from somewhere behind the glass, tracing letters from the inside out. Come back. He shut the laptop with a snap and sat in the dark, breathing hard. The words burned behind his eyelids. In the end, he didn't choose to go back to Willow Lake so much as he gave in to the inevitable pull. It felt like falling into an old habit, like reaching for a cigarette after years of quitting. One day he simply found himself once again on that dirt road, the trees pressing close, the sky a flat, oppressive gray. When he stepped out of the truck, the fog seemed to recognize him. It curled around his ankles, thick and clammy. The dock, unbelievably, still stood. More of it had sagged into the water. Some boards had disappeared entirely, leaving jagged teeth of wood jutting up. The posts leaned at drunken angles as if they'd been gnawed. As he walked toward it, each step felt like it weighed more, like the gravity near the water was different. He stopped at the edge of the shore, toes just shy of the first plank. "What do you want from me?" he asked. His voice came out hoarse. "Finish," something whispered, not from below this time, but from all around, in the sucking of mud and the rustle of reeds. His feet carried him forward. The boards complained, some so soft they bowed deeply under even his cautious weight. He ventured only as far as the place where, that first day, he'd felt the initial odd tug. He could feel the presence waiting beneath, patient, as if it had never left the spot. He didn't bring a flashlight this time. The sky was overcast, but there was enough light to see the water between gaps. It looked thicker than normal, its surface sluggish like syrup. He knelt, hands flat on the boards, feeling them cool and damp beneath his palms. "Take it back," he whispered. "Take whatever you think you have of me and let me go." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the boards warmed under his hands, heat radiating up as though something had pressed its face directly against the underside. The lake drew in a deep, shuddering breath. He smelled his childhood, his father's old flannel, the stale beer on his breath during their last trip here, the exact cheap sunscreen his ex used on their one ill-fated camping weekend. The memories came not as thoughts, but as sensations, as if the lake were rifling through him, tasting each experience on its way down. Hands emerged slowly from between the boards. More than two. They slid out, fingers splaying, nails tapping lightly as they found the spaces between his own fingers on the planks. The touch was cold but not quite solid, as if he were resting his hands on the surface of a deep pool. A face rose between his wrists, pushing up through the cracks. This time there was no doubt. It was him. Not bloated, not rotten, but wearing his current features like a mask. Eyes alight with a strange, eager intelligence. "You can't leave what you've cast," it said in his voice. "Hook is in. Line is set. We only reel." He wanted to argue, to shout that he'd never agreed to any of this, that he hadn't known. But underneath the terror was a tiny, traitorous part of him that recognized the twisted logic. He'd thrown a piece of himself into the water that day. Not just skin cells and sweat, but everything humming under his skin. Anger, regret, loneliness. The lake, or whatever lived in it, had been hungry enough to take the offering and clever enough to keep pulling. "Then what now?" he asked, barely audible. The thing smiled. The dock shifted. The world narrowed to the feel of the boards under his hands and the cold air on his neck. "You go," it said, "or you stay. But either way, I wear you." For a moment he saw two futures laid out like twin shorelines. In one he let go, slid forward, and broke through the decaying wood into the arms waiting below, the water closing over his head, his face rising again in the murk to greet the next curious fisherman. In the other he pulled back, left the dock, moved to another town, another life, always feeling a second heartbeat somewhere just beneath his own, knowing that somewhere in some black water something with his face watched and waited. In the end, survival instinct won by an inch. He ripped his hands off the boards, stumbling backward so fast he nearly fell onto the shore. The hands beneath the dock scrabbled for a moment, nails screeching against the old wood, then slipped away. The face sank out of sight, eyes never leaving his until the water swallowed them. He ran. He didn't remember getting into the truck, didn't remember starting the engine or the fishtail of gravel as he tore out of the clearing. He only came back to himself when he was back on the highway. The lake nothing but a weight behind him. Years later, in another city far from that county, Ethan sits in a small apartment with no pictures on the walls. He avoids windows at night, unless the blinds are closed. He doesn't keep mirrors in the house beyond the bare minimum. He hasn't set foot on a dock since, and he never ever drives past standing water if he can help it. But some mornings he wakes up with the smell of algae in his nose and the sensation of damp wood under his fingers. Sometimes, washing his hands, he'll look up and see his reflection watching him with a little too much interest. The smile trying just a bit too hard to follow. And every now and then, on an otherwise clear day, he'll walk past a storefront window and catch a glimpse of himself out of the corner of his eye, wearing an expression he doesn't remember making, eyes full of a patience he doesn't feel. And he'll think of the thing under the dock, of how it learned his face, and of how somewhere beneath the surface of some forgotten lake, something that sounds like his own voice is still breathing, waiting for the next line someone is foolish enough to cast. Story 2, Chum Line. The first time the sonar lit up, it looked like a blizzard made of meat. The green screen had been almost empty for hours, just the occasional lazy arc of a shark or the dull smudge of a bait ball drifting beneath the hull. But then, in less than 5 seconds, it went from calm to chaos. Hundreds of long, vertical streaks slammed into view from below, stacked so tight they turned the bottom of the display into a glowing wall, all of them rising straight up toward the boat at the same impossible angle. Mia had seen strange readings before in her years working marine surveys, but nothing like that. Fish didn't swim like that. Sharks definitely didn't. The shapes came in faster, filling the screen from the bottom up, and the beeping of the depth sounder climbed into a manic, continuous shriek that made the fillings in her teeth buzz. For a half-second she thought the unit had glitched out and was about to smack it with the heel of her hand like every impatient scientist on a boat eventually did. And then something hit the hull hard enough to knock her onto her knees. Bucket slid, a coil of rope toppled, and the red plastic pail of chum they'd been slowly pouring overboard tipped and dumped its entire clotting contents into the gulf in one thick gushing wave. Mia grabbed the nearest rail as the 100-year-old shrimp boat rolled, wood creaking like a tired animal. Dark water seethed out beyond the gunwale, and in the ghostly wash of the deck lights she saw it turn a shade darker still as blood and fish guts fanned out from the hull. For a split second, everything went dead still. The sonar stopped screaming. The boat settled, sloshing. Even the engine, throttled low to keep them drifting over their line, sounded suddenly far away, like it was coming through a wall. Then lots of somethings, began hitting the steel from below in rapid, hollow thumps like fists knocking from the wrong side of a door. She didn't scream right away. Her brain was busy trying to pull the night back into the box where it made sense. She was not some clueless tourist on a ghost tour. She was 29, a postdoc marine biologist with more time at sea than most of the guys she'd gone to grad school with. And she'd taken this consulting job with Captain Ray because a winter counting sharks paid better than waiting for another grant. She knew this boat, the Mary Ellen II, was old and loud and prone to complaining. She knew the Gulf could throw weird at you sometimes. Rogue waves, squalls that weren't on any forecast, lights on the horizon that turned out to be nothing but atmospheric tricks. You saw enough of that, you learned not to jump at every creek. But there were some things that never happened. Sharks didn't come straight up like that. The marks on the sonar were vertical, thin, and much too fast. And no school of bait fish hit a hull like that, not all together, not with that heavy, focused weight. Jesus, Tomas grunted from the stern, grabbing for the winch as a wave slapped the transom. What the hell did we roll over? Mia scrambled back to her feet and leaned over the sonar screen, wiping a smear of chum off the glass with the back of her hand. The mass had reached them now. The surface line, always calm, always reassuring, was fuzzed out by interference. The column of water between the bottom and the boat was a solid block of moving color. And in the middle of that storm of return, she saw them, narrower streaks clustered in bundles, small shapes hung in the water column like beads on a string. They looked like bodies. "Ray," she called, her voice finding a rough edge. "You need to see this." The captain didn't answer at first. He was at the bow, hunched over the rail, eyes on the water where the chum's slick fanned out, his weathered hands white-knuckled around a cigarette he'd forgotten to finish. 58, sunburned to leather and stubborn as the rust that had taken permanent hold of the Mary Ellen's bones, Ray had been running these waters out of Terrebonne Parish since before Mia was born, when she'd first climbed aboard 3 weeks ago with her duffel and her case of gear. He'd looked her up and down with an expression that said, "Another academic here to tell me about fish I've known longer than she's been alive." But he'd taken the contract anyway. Her research outfit had money. His boat needed a new generator. They'd made an uneasy peace after the second trip, bonded over the fact that neither of them trusted the new oil company exploration rigs that had started popping up like tumors along the horizon. Now he flicked his dead cigarette into the water and ambled back toward her, boots slipping a little on chum and seawater. If you tell me that's a school of mullet, I'm kicking your degree overboard. He joked weakly, trying to shake off the tension, but his eyes went sharp when he saw the screen. Ah, hell. Thomas spit into the scupper, muttering something in Spanish under his breath that sounded like a prayer. The wind shifted and brought the smell up thicker, iron and rot and something older. Mia's stomach rolled. She gutted her share of fish in labs and on boats. She wasn't squeamish, but this was different. There was a sour note under the blood that made the hair rise on the back of her neck. Currents must have dragged something up, she said, hating how unsure she sounded. Maybe a mass stranding, spawning gone wrong. Hey, her words died as something rolled just under the surface off the port bow. For a heartbeat, she thought it was the smooth gray arch of a shark's back. Then wave and light shifted and she saw hair, human hair, long and black, fanning like seagrass before vanishing in the froth. Did you see? She started. Nope, Ray cut in sharply. Didn't see anything, just trash. Trash doesn't have hair, she snapped. He ignored her, reaching for the throttle. We're moving off this line. We'll reset a mile east. Before his hand could close around the lever, the boat lurched sideways, a violent sucking tug dragging the stern 2 feet toward the port as if some enormous hand had grabbed the keel. Mia grabbed for the console, slamming her shoulder into it as metal screamed below her feet. The engine coughed. In the wash of the stern light, she saw the water change color again. Not just with blood this time, but with some thicker darkness that swirled up from below, like oil but too alive, too structured, climbing rather than rising. The radio on the bulkhead crackled. At first it was only static, thin and high. Then threaded through it came a voice. Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen too. What the hell are you doing on top of me? Mia's blood ran cold. She knew that voice, knew it so well she'd woken to it in nightmares for years after the Coast Guard had stopped searching. Jesse, her older brother, dead 3 years now when his own shrimp boat had gone down in a storm that had supposedly come out of nowhere. They'd never found his body. She stared at the radio, heart slamming. The channel indicator showed 16, distress and hailing. The squelch knob hadn't been touched in hours. Ray, she whispered, did you hear? Turn that shit off, he barked, eyes never leaving the churning black water. Her hand hovered over the power switch. But now, Mia. She flipped it off, hand shaking. The cabin went quieter, but the ringing in her ears didn't fade. The phantom weight of Jesse's voice hung in the air, heavy as humidity. Thomas shouted from the stern, Cap, look at this. They hurried back. The net line they'd left dragging lazily while they drifted had gone taut as a piano string, the winch straining, motor ticking with effort. The float markers bobbed erratically, then began to dip one by one as if something heavy were crawling along the net from one end to the other, pulling it under. We didn't set for a trawl, Mia said. It should be free. There's nothing on that bottom but silt here. We mapped it. Yeah, well, Ray growled. Tell that to whatever just decided to hitch a ride. He slapped the winch control. Haul it in. We'll cut it loose if we have to. The motor groaned as the steel cable inched back, dripping and shivering. The boat listed slightly as the weight began to come aboard, stern sinking an inch deeper. The overhead deck light flickered once, twice, like a nervous eye. The 3 of them watched in tense silence as the floats knocked against the hull one after the other. Somewhere beneath them, something thumped the bottom again. Once, twice, conversationally. The net breached the surface slowly, emerging from the black water like something being birthed. For half a second, Mia's mind tried to slot the shape into familiar categories. A huge old tire, a snagged log, a big ray. Then the thing turned, rolled limply, and a white, bloated human arm slapped wetly against the gunwale. She flinched back, bile burning her throat. The body, or what was left of it, slid further into view. It wore the tatters of a bright blue rain jacket, the color she'd once bought for Jesse as a joke, telling him it would make him easy to find if he fell overboard. The jacket was shredded across the chest, fabric ripped as if pulls had come from every direction. The torso beneath was worse. The skin was chewed away in places, ribs bared in careful arcs. Some of them were cracked, some missing entirely, gnawed clean. No legs, no head, just empty meat and bone swinging in the net like a grotesque pendulum. There was a tattoo on one remaining forearm, though, half obscured by bloating and damage but still visible. A small, stylized shrimp curling around an anchor. Jessie's tattoo. Mia's knees went out. She grabbed the rail to keep from falling. "No," she said, voice barely a sound. "No, that can't—" "It isn't him," Ray said tightly. "It's a jacket like his. Thousands of those sold. Could be anyone. But the tattoo. Coincidence." His jaw worked. "Body's old. Been down there a long time. Plenty of us go missing on this water. Don't go making it ghosts when it's just bad luck." Under different circumstances, she might have argued, might have pointed out the pattern of the bite marks, the way they radiated from the chest cavity as if something had burrowed inside and worked its way out. But the boat lurched again, more violently this time, cutting off all thoughts that weren't focused on staying upright. The hanging torso swung, smacking against the hull with a wet thud. The net lines creaked in protest. "Cut it," Thomas hissed. "Cap, we gotta cut it loose. This is bad luck, man. This is—" Before Ray could answer, the sonar started screaming again. The beeping turned to a continuous, ear-splitting tone. The shapes on the screen surged up from the bottom with renewed fury, filling every inch between seabed and surface. The water around the boat boiled. Dark shapes sliced under the hull, maybe 6 feet long, maybe 10. It was impossible to tell in the chaotic chop. At first, Mia thought they were sharks, driven into a frenzy by the chum and the body in the net. That would have been almost comforting in a brutal, familiar way. But then one broke the surface right beside the transom, rising half out of the water in a roiling swirl, and she saw it clearly. It wasn't a shark. It was roughly the size of a human, maybe a little bigger. Its skin a sickly, translucent gray that showed muscles writhing underneath like eels in a sack. It had no eyes. Where eye sockets should have been was only smooth, pale skin stretched tight. Its mouth, though, if you could call it that, was an obscene slit running from where one ear should be to the other, lipless and rigid, lined with tiny, inward-pointing teeth like those of a lamprey. As it opened that slit, it made a sound that was part hiss, part bubbling, part low, echoing moan. Something about the tone hit her chest in the same way the sonar beep had hit her ears. Her heart stuttered in time with it, skipping a beat. It clamped that horror of a mouth onto the hanging torso with a speed that made her eyes water. Flesh tore with a noise like wet fabric ripping. The net jerked, fibers snapping. "Cut it," Ray roared, voice cracking on the last word. Thomas was already moving, knife flashing in his hand. He hacked at the lines, cursing when the blade slipped on the wet rope. Another of the creatures surfaced on the opposite side of the corpse, then another. They came straight up, bodies vertical in the water, spines too flexible, mouths chewing, working, worrying at the meat with single-minded hunger. Their eyeless heads turned toward the hull even as they fed, as if they could feel the warm bodies above, sense the blood pumping through veins. The last line parted with a sharp twang. The net slipped away, corpse and all, torn to shreds even as it sank. For a heartbeat, everything was bizarrely calm again. The sonar returned to its normal beeping, though the screen still showed the storm of returns around them. The engine chugged. The 3 humans on deck stood frozen, breathing hard, every muscle locked. Then the boat dropped. It wasn't much in terms of distance, maybe a foot, maybe less, but it felt like an elevator having its cables cut. The Mary Ellen's stern plunged, throwing them against the rails. The deck pitched so far, Mia had a dizzying view of nothing but sky. She heard the brittle crack of something below, a strut, a rib, something structural. And for one wild, sick instant, she thought the entire boat was about to be yanked straight under like a toy. "Hold on!" Ray bellowed, grabbing the wheel with one hand and the throttle with the other. He slammed it forward, engine screaming in protest as the prop fought whatever had wrapped itself around the hull. The boat juddered, seemed to hover between submission and escape. Then, with a shriek of tortured metal, it lurched free. The stern popped back up, slamming down into a trough of dark water that splashed high over the transom. In that spray, lit by the harsh white of the deck lights, Mia saw them clearly. Dozens of those eyeless heads just below the surface, some with their mouths still open, teeth bared in the instant before the wave crashed down. They weren't scattered like feeding sharks. They were packed tight, almost shoulder to shoulder, all facing the boat, all vertical, all thinking. They tore away from the hull reluctantly, their pale bodies writhing as if they disliked losing the contact. As the boat surged ahead, some followed, slipping just beneath the surface in eerie unison, riding the turbulence. Others dove, their vertical streaks on the sonar turning and angling away. But none of them fled outright. They just repositioned. "Where the hell did those come from?" Thomas yelled, his voice high with panic. "Those aren't in any book, man. There's no name for that." Mia gripped the console so hard her knuckles creaked. Her scientist's brain, even drowning in terror, was cataloging eyeless, deep adapted, vertical hunting behavior, abnormal aggregation. They shouldn't be here in this shallow shelf water. They shouldn't exist anywhere near the rigs, the pipelines, the mess of human noise and light. Creatures like that belonged in the trenches, in black pits 3 miles down where sunlight never touched and pressure could crush a submarine like a beer can. Behind them, toward the southwest, the horizon was stained with a cluster of lights, too bright and too many to be a town. One of the new deep rigs, she knew. The company that had hired her up to do impact assessments had spoken proudly of experimental subsea detonations they were using to restructure the seabed. Cheaper, they'd said, than delicate drilling. Efficient. On the sonar, a bloom of interference fanned out from that direction like fireworks underwater. The creatures around them flinched at each pulse, their marks scattering, then surging back, drawn like moths to a flame even as it burned them. "What did they wake up?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Ray heard her anyway, his mouth twisted. "Doesn't matter what it is," he said. "What matters is we're getting away from it. Strap in." He turned the wheel hard, angling them away from both the rig and the worst of the returns on the sonar. The old boat shuddered, protesting the abuse, but responded. Slowly, agonizingly, the swarm shifted away on the screen. Some of the marks following, but many staying behind, hovered over whatever scar had been torn into the seabed by human hands. The radio, still off, crackled anyway. The speaker popped, emitting a single low moan that warbled into static and died. Mia stared at it. That's not possible. Thomas crossed himself, lips moving silently. They ran hard for nearly 20 minutes, the engine howling, every creak of the hull a reminder of the strain it had just endured. The farther they got, the fewer impacts they felt from below. The sonar gradually, grudgingly, began to look normal again, the wall of returns thinning to occasional blips. Eventually, the depth sounder settled into a steady, sane rhythm. The water behind them was calm, at least on the surface. No one spoke until the rig's lights were a smear on the horizon behind them and another, friendlier glow began to form ahead. The low sprawl of the shipyard and the weaker, warmer lights of the small Coast Guard outpost. When they were finally tied up to the dock, paperwork rubber-banded to a clipboard in Ray's trembling hands as he went. Through the motions of logging their trip, Mia found herself standing at the stern, staring down at the water lapping against the worn wood. The surface was only a few feet below. She could see her reflection there, broken into fragments by the ripples. For a heartbeat, another face seemed to drift just beneath it, featureless and pale, following the outline of the hull. She blinked, and it was just water. "Don't go leaning too far over," a voice drawled behind her. She turned to see one of the young coasties standing on the dock, life vest unzipped, clipboard under his arm. His name tag read, Harris. He gave her a half-smile. "You folks had a rough one, huh? Cap says you pulled up some human remains?" She swallowed. "Yeah. Won't be the last," he said, more grim than flippant. "A lot of junk's getting stirred up out there. Rigs, explosions, storms. You hear stuff on the radio some nights. Not calls, just stuff." "Like what?" she asked, even though she didn't want to know. He scratched his cheek, looking out past her to where the Gulf lay black and patient beyond the dock lights. "Voices," he said finally. "On channels nobody's supposed to be using. Depth sounders tripping off in flat calm. Big schools of something hugging right under the hull. We had a cutter come in last month with slime on the bottom we couldn't identify. Smelled like old meat and batteries, like something pulled up from way down where it should have stayed." He shrugged, trying for casual. "But hey, I just signed the reports." Mia looked back at the Mary Ellen II. The old shrimp boat sat low in the water, her scuffed hull quiet now, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But as she watched, a single bubble rose from somewhere along her keel, broke the surface, and popped with a faint wet sigh. That night, in the tiny bunk they'd given her above the galley, she woke 3 separate times to the sound of sonar beeping in her dreams. Each time it started off normal, the friendly ping she'd heard on countless boats, then sped up, higher and higher, until it turned into Jesse's laugh, then his scream, then the bubbling moan of the eyeless things gnawing at the net. When she finally gave up on sleep and staggered barefoot to the galley for coffee, the boat was perfectly still. The only sound was the gentle slap of water on the hull and the occasional distant blast of a ship's horn. She transferred off the contract a week later. The official reason on the paperwork was incompatible schedules. The real reason was that every time she heard a depth sounder, even in a training video, her skin crawled and her chest tightened, and she could almost feel teeth pressing into her ribs from the inside. Months passed. She moved inland, took a job teaching, surrounded herself with maps and data instead of waves and weather. She told herself she was done with boats, with the Gulf, with pretending that humans had any idea what really moved in the holes they drilled and detonated. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the fridge kicked on with a low mechanical hum, she'd swear she heard a different rhythm underneath it. A faint, distant beeping like sonar finding something in the dark. On those nights, if she turned on her kitchen sink and let the water run, she could smell just for a second that same metallic old blood stench from the night on the Mary Ellen. Once, when she couldn't stand it anymore, she shut off every appliance, unplugged everything in the house, and listened hard. From somewhere deep below the foundation, so far down it had no business reaching her, came the softest, wettest knock, spaced out in long, patient intervals, like something was bumping against the underside of the world, testing it. She moved again after that, farther from the coast, to a city with rivers instead of open water. Friends asked why she insisted on third-floor apartments, on buildings set well back from any shoreline. She joked about rising seas, about floodplains, about boring grown-up things like insurance. She never told them about the night her brother's voice had come through a dead radio, asking what the hell she was doing on top of him, or the way the sonar had shown those impossible vertical streaks rising from a trench exploded open by human greed, full of things that had never known light until now. She still reads marine journals. Old habits die hard. Every few months, tucked between studies on declining shark populations and coral bleaching, she'll see a brief, nervously worded note: unexplained damage to subsea cabling, unidentifiable biofilm on drill heads, deep-diving ROV loses camera feed in a storm of biological interference. She doesn't need the pictures. She can close her eyes and see the eyeless heads, the vertical bodies, the way they latched on not just to flesh but to anything that vibrated with human life. Sometimes she dreams in sonar. The world goes dark except for the thin green line of the surface and the harsh, bright returns below. At first there are only a few, scattered and shy. Then from the blackness at the bottom a wall starts to rise, hundreds, then thousands of shapes, all vertical, all aligned, all coming straight up. In the dream, she is back on the Mary Ellen II, her hand hovering over the throttle, the radio crackling at her elbow with her brother's voice and a chorus of others, some she recognizes, some she doesn't, all asking the same voiceless question that isn't really a question at all. What they woke up is awake now, and it is hungry. Story 3. Frozen Catch. By the third night, every hole Caleb had drilled in the ice was saying his name. At first, it was just a feeling that when the wind dropped and the blizzard's roar broke for a moment, the tiny dark mouths in the white, the neat circles he'd carved for fishing, were listening. Then it became something else. Standing in the cramped warmth of the shack, propane heater hissing and coffee cooling on the crate he used as a table, he heard it for real. A long breath pushed up from under the lake, funneled through 10 inches of ice and a 6-inch auger cut, stretching his name into a sound like old wood shifting. Caleb. He told himself it was the storm, or air trapped between layers, or some stupid trick of his brain after too many nights alone. But when he stepped closer, when he crouched over the nearest hole with his gloves off so he could feel the cold radiating up from the black below, the voice rose again, more than one this time, thin and overlapping, like different recordings of the same word, all playing slightly out of sync. Caleb jerked back, banging his shoulder on the plywood wall. The shack shivered on its runners, chains creaking where they were anchored to the buried ice screws, and for a heartbeat he could have sworn the whole frozen surface flexed like skin. He wasn't supposed to be out here alone in the first place. That's what his daughter had said on the phone before Christmas. "Dad, you're not 25 anymore. Go with a group. Or I don't know. Maybe skip the part where you sit on a frozen lake by yourself with a hole under your feet." He'd laughed, the sound bouncing around the empty trailer he'd moved into after the divorce, and told her he liked the quiet, that after 30 years driving long-haul trucks with a diesel engine chewing in his ears and CB chatter frying the air, silence was the nicest sound in the world. She hadn't pushed it. She'd moved 2 provinces over with some IT job he didn't really understand. Phone calls once a week, video when she remembered. He didn't blame her. You raised kids so they'd leave you, that was the whole point. Still, after he hung up, he'd stared at the dent in the couch where she used to curl up watching cartoons and the way the winter light angled through the blinds onto the same coffee table they'd put puzzles on back when his knuckles didn't ache. The ice shack out on White Hart Lake had seemed like an answer he could actually afford. He'd bought the shack second-hand from a guy in town whose eyes had that far-away, watery look of someone who'd seen too many winters and not enough summers. "You'll hear things out there," the man had told him while they grunted and slid the plywood structure onto Caleb's flatbed. "Blows through the old vents, ain't nothing. Just the lake remembering." Caleb had nodded, humoring him, thinking of the ad he'd read online. "Sturdy 2-man shanty, good deal, must. Pick up moving." He'd liked the way sturdy sounded. After the year he'd had, sturdy was about all he dared ask for. When he'd asked what the townie meant by remembering, the man had shrugged and spat into the snow. "Miners' stories," he'd said. "My granddad swore this was a valley once before they flooded it. Town down there somewhere under the ice. People too, if you believe drunks. They say if you drill in the wrong spot, you get ghosts instead of pike." Then he'd laughed and said tourists loved that sort of crap. White Hart wasn't on a lot of maps. It sat a couple hours north of the last city most people had heard of, past a pulp mill that bleached the air and a gas station that sold coffee strong enough to chew. By the time Caleb turned onto the last logging road, his cell signal had given up, replaced by the unwavering hiss of static. Trees closed in on both sides, branches heavy with real snow instead of the dirty slush that turned city streets into gray soup. The lake itself appeared all at once around a bend, a low white expanse ringed by dark spruce, wind kicking plumes of powder off the surface like breath. Someone had plowed a rough path onto the ice, scarred with ruts and frozen ridges. A handful of other shacks dotted the lake, boxy silhouettes in the distance, smoke curling from a few of their chimneys. Seeing them had reassured him. People did this every year. People went out, drilled holes, drank too much beer, told stories, and went home with fish and frost nip. He'd picked a spot farther from the cluster than he needed to, more from habit than anything. 30 years of sleeping in truck stop cabs had made him crave distance between his walls and anyone else's. He checked the ice thickness like he'd been taught as a kid, drilled, measured, drilled again. 10 inches, 12, 14 near the center where he finally stopped. "Plenty," said the numbers. He backed the shack off the flatbed, skidding it across the scraped surface, his breath smoking in the sharp air. The edges of the plywood were worn, a few old stickers half scraped off the exterior. A curling beer logo, a cartoon fish with crossed-out eyes, some faded letters that might once have spelled out a family name. Inside it smelled like propane and old smoke and wet wool. 2 plywood bunks, a little counter with a camp stove, a rack of nails hammered into one wall that still held the ghosts of where coats and rods had hung. Someone had carved initials into the corner of one bunk, MR, and scratched a date beside it from 8 winters back. Caleb ran his glove over it, feeling the grooves. He wondered who MR had been with. If they'd still be out on some other lake this season, or if they'd given it up. He set up like he'd done 100 times with his father on different lakes decades ago, the motions falling into place even as they felt heavier. Drill here, drill there, sweep the ice chips aside with a boot, skim the black water open with a little scoop until it reflected the plywood ceiling instead of sky. Each hole was a perfect circle of night in the white, a coin slot into the deep. He ran his fingers around the edges once, feeling the smoothness of the cut, the fine powder clinging to his skin. The first time he dropped a line, the bobber dipped almost instantly, tugged by some eager perch or jackfish. He grinned, alone in the little shack, the sound startling him. Maybe this trip wouldn't be so bad. Maybe he'd get a decent video or two for his daughter. The ASMR she teased him about, the old man whispering about Fish Channel he'd started to learn editing on. The first day passed easily. Snow ticked on the roof. The wind rose and fell. He fried his catch on the camp stove with too much butter, the smell rich and clean. At one point in the afternoon, another fisherman on a snowmobile trundled past, lifting a hand in a lazy salute before continuing on toward the cluster of shacks closer to shore. The sky went from white to blue to a bruised, endless dark. Stars came out one by one, sharp as ice chips. Around midnight, when he finally shut off the lantern and tucked himself into the sleeping bag on the lower bunk. He lay there listening to the muffled pops and cracks of the ice expanding, the familiar alien music of a frozen lake breathing. It had always spooked him a little as a kid, but his dad had told him it was a good sound. It meant the ice was thick, alive, settling into itself. He pulled his hat down over his ears and let the sounds fade into his dreams. The second day was when things changed. The morning started normal enough. He woke to frost rimming the inside of the shack's windows, his breath a pale cloud. The heater took the edge off slowly. He made coffee so strong the spoon almost stood up in it. When he opened the shack door to piss, the cold slapped him full in the face, stealing his breath. The sky had that low pewter look that meant more snow. The far shore blurred by a haze that might have been flurries already in the air. He hurried back inside, cheeks burning, and sank his line again, the comforting little plink as the weight punched through the thin skim of refrozen ice over each hole. At first, he just noticed that the sound of the lake under the normal noises, ice adjusting, occasional groans, was off somehow. Duller, like there was more under there than there should be, some unseen insulation. He chalked it up to the coming weather. Around mid-morning, on his third cup of coffee, the first odd thing surfaced. He just felt a good, solid hit on his line, the kind that dragged the rod tip down hard and made his shoulder come alive, when the weight vanished so suddenly he almost fell backward. He swore, reeled up fast, heart pounding with the annoyed excitement of perhaps having lost a big one. The line came up clean. Mostly, no fish, no bait, just his hook twisted open like someone with too much patience had used pliers on it. And hung on the end of the bent metal, threaded the way he usually threaded a minnow, was a ring. It was a plain gold band, dulled by time, but still catching the lantern light as it swung. For a second he thought it was trash some careless couple had dropped into the lake years back, a wedding ring lost in some summer's drunken swim. Then the line spun and he saw the inside, where letters and numbers had been engraved. He squinted. The metal was worn, but he could make out pieces, L, O, V, and a date, not a recent one, from the 1970s if he was reading it right. He held it in his gloved palm for longer than he meant to, feeling the ridiculous urge to apologize to whoever had dropped it, to wonder if the person it had been on had ever made it out of this lake. He flipped it onto the counter, meaning to deal with it later, and rebaited. Things like that got lost in lakes all the time, didn't they? Rings, lures, beer cans, bits of people's lives. It didn't have to mean anything. The second catch was harder to shrug off. It came just after noon when the wind had started to pick up and snow had begun whispering against the shack walls and roof. The whole structure shuddered occasionally, a reminder that it was just screwed into ice, not planted on real ground. He'd gotten two small pike, their bodies stiff and glazed on the floor outside, when another strong tug nearly pulled the rod into the nearest hole. He snatched it, reflexes honed from years of having to react fast to keep 10 tons of truck in its lane when something stupid happened ahead. This thing fought hard, jerking down, then up, then in circles that set ripples slapping against the underside of the ice. "Well, come on then," he grunted through his teeth, muscles burning as he hauled. "Let's see you." When whatever it was broke the surface, the shack went very quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. Hanging off the end of his line was a child's boot. For a second, his mind refused to process it as anything but some weird, heavy piece of trash. It dripped lake water onto the ice, dark rubber glistening, a tiny cartoon moose decal half peeled off the side. The laces, one of them completely missing, hung stiff. The toe was scraped, scuffed white where it had once met pavement or rock. It looked like every cheap winter boot he'd seen on kids in hardware stores and schoolyards his whole life. The size hit him in the gut. Maybe 4, maybe smaller. Something shriveled and pale protruded just inside the cuff, caught on the hook. At first he thought it was a soggy sock. He leaned closer, breath fogging, and realized it was skin. He dropped the rod. It clattered on the floor, line going slack, boot swinging. For one ugly, cowardly heartbeat, he considered shoving it back through the hole with his boot and pretending he'd never seen it. No one knew he was out here. No one would ever know. But another part of him, the same part that had made him swerve instead of plowing down a stray dog on a winter highway at 3 a.m, even though it risked his own truck, grabbed the rod again. With hands that didn't seem entirely attached to his arms, he reeled the thing in the rest of the way and lay it on the shack floor. Up close, he could see the skin better. It was gray-white, with a faint bluish tint, fused to the inside of the boot in places where time and cold had melded them together. Toes, he realized. Little toes. He gagged, swallowed hard against bile, and then stomped to the door, flung it open, and hurled the boot as far as he could into the wind-lashed white. It tumbled end over end, a dark shape against the storm, then vanished into whirling snow. He stood in the doorway for a long time after that, cold cutting through his clothes, listening. The wind howled. The other shacks out on the lake were only vague smudges now, barely visible through the curtain of falling white. He thought distantly that no one would see him if he went down. By the time anyone realized his truck hadn't left its parking spot at the shore, the lake would have closed over whatever hole had taken him, smoothing itself back into a featureless field. He stayed inside the rest of that afternoon. He made soup and didn't eat it. He stared at the old initials carved into the bunk and wondered how many people had slept here thinking this was just another winter camp, just another stretch of quiet. When the light started to fade, what little of it pierced the storm in the first place, he turned on the lantern again and tried desperately to watch something on his phone. An old sitcom he'd downloaded for when the silence got too big. The laugh track sounded wrong in the cramped shack, too loud, the canned joy echoing off plywood like it was trapped. He turned it off. That was when he heard the knocking. At first he thought someone had pulled up outside, a snowmobile maybe, some crazy neighbor checking on the idiot who'd parked his shack too far from the pack. He waited for an engine to fade, for a voice. Instead, the knock came again, below him this time. A dull, wet thump that reverberated up through the floor. Another. It wasn't loud. If he'd been talking or if the TV had been going, he might not have noticed. But in the tense quiet, it was as distinct as a heartbeat. He sat very still on the bunk, breath shallow, listening. Thump. A pause just long enough for him to start wondering if he'd imagined it. Thump. The sound seemed to move slightly between knocks, circling under the shack. Thump at the far corner, thump under the heater, thump directly beneath the bunk. The ice shifts, he told himself under his breath. It's just the ice. It's fine. Then something scraped along the underside of the floor, something not ice, not the natural pop of expansion, not the sigh of pressure equalizing. It was the drag of something solid and deliberate moving, against wood, like fingertips. His throat went dry. With movements that felt like they belonged to someone else, he reached for the little handheld recorder sitting on the crate, the one he used for practice voiceovers. He clicked it on without really thinking why, just needing something else to anchor him. Some proof later that this had actually happened and wasn't just his brain folding in on itself out of loneliness. The red light winked on. Test, he said hoarsely, forcing normalcy into his voice. Fishing log, day 2. Weather's turned. As if cued by his words, the wind outside hit the side of the shack with a new, angry force. The walls rattled. Fine powder hissed through hairline gaps in the boards. The knocking below him stopped. For a moment, he almost laughed in relief. See? Just nerves. Just Caleb. His name rose from the nearest fishing hole in a chorus of whispers. He froze, every muscle locking. The recorder sat in his hand, plastic suddenly slick with sweat. He stared at the black circle in the floor, at the way the lantern's reflection ringed it in flickering gold. The voice, or voices, hadn't been loud. If anyone had been talking in the shack, if a radio had been on, it would have been lost. But in the stunned silence, it was as clear as his own thoughts. There was a child's pitch in there somewhere, thin and high. Underneath it, something older, rough and drowned, all of them saying his name in the drawn-out, aching way of someone finally being answered after calling for a very long time. He didn't move toward the hole. He didn't move away from it either. He just sat there, fingers clamped around the recorder, breath fogging the air in front of him. "Caleb," the hole said again, a fraction louder, as if realizing he'd heard it and gaining confidence. The words stretched, syllables sliding into each other. Ka-leeb. Around the shack, the other holes picked it up, one by one at first, then together until the whole floor seemed to pulse with it. Caleb, Caleb, Caleb. It wasn't quite in sync. Some lagged, some jumped ahead, some lingered on vowels like they didn't quite remember how human mouths were supposed to work. He found his voice somewhere behind his tightened chest. "What do you want?" he asked, hating the tremor in his own words. For a second, there was only the howl of the storm and the quiet, unforgiving crackle of the heater. Then, "Out," they breathed. "Cold, dark, out." Images came unbidden, a valley before the dam, according to the old man who'd sold him the shack. Streets and houses and a small church, a school, a mine entrance yawning like a black tooth at the edge of town. Sirens. A winter thaw that came too early one year and a rain that wouldn't stop, softening the ground under decades of careless excavations. A rush of mud and broken rock, men and women and children running, slipping, swallowed. The valley filling, slowly with water, held back by concrete walls and human pride. Homes dissolved, air turned to silt, bodies that didn't make it to higher soil sinking into the new dark. And above it all, the years pressing down, ice forming, thawing, forming again. A new lake on old bones, he hadn't seen any of that. But as the voices whispered, the images were as clear and cold in his mind as the ice inches from his boots. "Not my problem," he whispered back, equally to them and to himself. You're just air, in cracks, that's all. Help us," something insisted from the far hole, the word warped but desperate. "You drilled, you opened. We can feel the air through your holes." As if to prove the point, an icy draft tickled his ankles, rising from the black circles at his feet. He thought of the filled-in town stories, of the valley under the reservoir, of old-timers in the gas station saying you could still see roofs down there when the level was low enough. He thought of the ring, the boot, the stories about ghost towns people made into spooky tourist attractions, like history was a costume you could put on and take off. He swallowed. His throat clicked. "What happens if I help you?" "Then we go," the nearest hole hissed. The voice in it sounded young, so young. "We stop calling. We stop pulling." "Pulling what?" he asked, even though he already knew. "Lines," something else said. "Feet, houses, time." He laughed once, a short, hysterical bark. "You expect me to what, chisel you all out? Drag a whole drowned town up through 6-inch holes?" Silence fell like a blanket, so complete it made his ears ring. Then quietly one voice said, "Just one. Trade. You know trade. You drove trade all your life." He thought of the boot again, vanishing into the white. His hands flexed on the recorder until the plastic creaked. The heater popped. Somewhere out in the storm, something heavy shifted. Maybe snow, maybe ice, maybe something in the buried town settling. He put the recorder down gently on the crate and stood on knees that didn't want to obey. His legs ached. His back ached. He felt every one of his 52 years as he stepped to the nearest hole and looked down. Blackness stared back. It wasn't the soft black of clear water, depth fading into invisibility. It was a full, solid dark, like the absence of anything at all. "What kind of trade?" he asked. There was a flurry of whispers as if the holes were conferring, multiple mouths pressed to the underside of the ice. When one finally spoke for them, its voice was thin and threadbare. Someone up, someone down, door needs weight. He jerked upright, heat flushing through his cold, numbed body in a single wave. No! You're alone, another voice cooed. It somehow managed to make the observation sound both sympathetic and pleased. No one will miss you, not for days. We know, listen. How long had they been listening? To his phone calls, to his muttered complaints, to the silence after he'd hung up with his daughter and stared at the wall, to the road between his house and the lake, to the groan of his old truck, to the sigh he'd let out when he stepped onto the ice like it was a reprieve. The storm outside redoubled its efforts, wind slamming against the shack in gusts that rattled the bolts. The whole structure shifted a few millimeters, then stilled. Snow hissed under the door. Shadows slid along the walls, branches in the wind, or something else much lower, closer. He stepped back from the hole, sucking in a breath that felt like knives in his lungs. No trade, he said, voice rough. Not like that. You want out, find another way. For the first time, something like anger crept into the chorus. The next gust that hit the shack had weight to it, like a shove. The heater's flame flickered low, then struggled back. From below, the knocking returned, louder now, shaking cups on the shelf. Thump, thump, thump. The sound moved in a tight circle under the shack, tracing its outline. With each impact, a fine puff of ice dust fell from the seams in the floor. Caleb braced himself against the bunk, suddenly aware of the emptiness beyond these thin boards and insulation. It wasn't just cold and snow and wind out there. It was 40 meters of water. And under that... Okay, he rasped. Not because he'd changed his mind, but because he needed the pounding to stop before the whole contraption shook itself apart. Okay, just stop that, talk to me. The knocking ceased mid-thump. In its wake, the quiet rang. When the voice came again, it was softer, sadder. We were you once, it said. Wives, husbands, children, men who worked, women who washed. We ate. We slept. We thought we had time. Then the ground went. A slow rolling sensation passed under the shack, like distant thunder in liquid form. He imagined the mine collapse the old stories were based on. The rain-slick hillsides giving way, whole streets sliding house by house into a churning, mud-filled grave. He saw people pounding on doors that no longer opened to air. He wondered how long it had taken the last bubbles to reach the surface as the valley drowned. Had anyone on the original shore listened as they popped? You drove past, another voice whispered. So many times, up the highway, down again. Your wheels hummed over the culvert where the old river runs in. You never knew we were under you. He had driven that stretch countless times, never thinking of what lay beneath the asphalt. To him, the reservoir had been a patch of blue on a map, a rest stop's faded scenic view, a glint of water between the trees. To them, it had been a ceiling. What do you want me to do? He asked, genuinely lost now. The idea of trading someone else, of deliberately luring a body out here to shove through the ice, made his stomach flip. But the storm outside was a living thing, and the thing under the ice was many living things, and both had him pinned. Open, they said together. Open more. His first thought was that they wanted more holes, bigger ones, enough for whole shapes to pass through. The idea of the ice splitting under his boots, of the shack tilting and sliding, of cold filling his throat, made black spots dance at the edges of his vision. Open. What? Your house, the youngest voice whispered. Your pipes, your drains, your tub. Water in, water out. Roads of water, we feel them. We almost fit. It hit him then properly. The reservoir wasn't an isolated bubble, it fed rivers. Those rivers fed other lakes, other watersheds. Those fed into city pipes, into treatment plants, into the veins of civilization. Whatever was down here had already been pressing its face against the gates in 1,000 different places. All it needed was a door left carelessly ajar, a hairline crack in a fitting, a place where negative pressure met something hungrier. "No," he said again, but weaker this time. "No, that's not how anything works." "Is now," a voice sighed. "They drilled, they pumped, they pulled rocks and left holes, they made new paths, they drip and drip and drip into us. We swell, we rot, we listen, we want out." A prolonged shudder ran through the shack. The lantern swayed on its hook. Somewhere out on the lake there was a deep, muffled boom like a distant avalanche. For a second the floor tipped just enough for him to grab for the wall. When it settled, the holes were a fraction of an inch wider, ice edges crumbly, black centers almost imperceptibly larger. His heart pounded so fiercely he felt it behind his eyes. The idea of going back to shore in this storm, of trying to inch his way over a lake that might be fracturing under him, felt like suicide. The idea of staying, of being the only warm heart on a cold plate, felt worse. He did the only thing he could think of that felt like something. He picked up the recorder. His fingers left damp prints on the plastic. He clicked it on and held it close to his mouth. "My name is Caleb Rourke," he said, voice rough. "If anyone ever finds this, I was on White Hart Lake, February 12th. There was a storm. There was, something under the ice. I'm not crazy. I heard them. The recorder clicked off. He blinked, thumb hovering over the red button. He hadn't moved it. The little device sat dead in his hand, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge his press. A faint, tinny hiss rose from its speaker anyway, building like pressure. "Don't tell," the recorder whispered in his own voice, then much softer, layered under his tone. "They won't believe." He stared at the blank display, at the tiny scratch near the battery compartment his granddaughter had made with a misplaced toy screwdriver last summer. His reflection ghosted over the dead, screen pale in the lantern light, eyes too wide. His jaw moved a split second before the image's jaw did. That half-beat lag, almost imperceptible, stopped his heart. He dropped the recorder. It hit the floor and skidded toward the nearest hole, bumping to a stop an inch from the edge. For a moment it teetered, then settled. The voices from below giggled, a horrible sound. The high, bright laughter of children echoed through drowned lungs. "You can't get out," one of them said cheerfully. "Storm, cracks, weak places we can push if we need." As if on cue, a violent gust hammered the shack hard enough to make the far wall bow inward. A hair-thin fissure snaked across the ceiling, shedding a fine dusting of frost. From under the floor the knocking resumed, more insistent now, hammering in counterpoint to his pulse. He'd never been a praying man beyond a few muttered bargains with fate on black ice roads. But he found himself pressing his palm flat to the nearest wall all the same, whispering to whatever might be listening, God, the lake, the ghosts below, that he didn't want to die here. Not like this. Not as a trade. "Then don't," a small voice said soothingly from the hole nearest his boot. "We'll go instead. You help. You show us roads, pipes, places. We'll ride what you rode. You got out. We can too." He knew, with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with temperature, that if he said yes, something would change in the room. The pressure would shift. The storm might even ease, giving him a path back to shore. He also knew, as surely as he knew the texture of a steering wheel under his hands, that if he agreed to be their guide in any way, it wouldn't stop with him. Those voices would find cracks in everything. In his daughter's voicemail box, in his granddaughter's bathtub, in the storm drains 3 cities away. The shack leaped. This time there was no mistaking it. Something had struck the ice from below, right in the center of its footprint, lifting it a fraction, then dropping it again. The holes sloshed. Black water lapped at their rims, kissing the wood. One of the bunks creaked, a screw tearing half out of its pilot hole. He did the only other thing he could think of. He ran. He threw open the door into a wall of white so solid it felt like cotton stuffed down his throat. Wind punched him, stealing his breath, driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. He staggered out onto the scraped patch in front of the shack, nearly going to his knees as his boots hit uneven ice. Behind him, the door banged on its hinges, then was caught and slammed shut by a gust, the latch clicking from sheer force. For a second, he almost turned back. Warmth, relative but still, was in there. His coat, his hat, his gloves. Out here, he was just a thing on a plate. One more upright object in a blank infinity. But under his feet, he felt movement. Slow, ponderous. The kind of shift that had nothing to do with normal expansion. A deep subterranean heave, like something rolling over in its sleep. He didn't have his GPS, didn't have his phone. He'd left them on the bunk. Stupid. He cursed himself and then cursed himself again for worrying about electronics while something ancient and patient tried to decide whether or not to crack the ice and swallow him. The only things he had were his boots, his thick parka, and the dim memory of which direction the plowed trail lay. He picked a heading based on the faint lighter smear of sky where he thought shore should be and started walking. Not running. Running on ice in a whiteout was a good way to fall, crack your head, and give the lake exactly what it wanted. Step, breathe, step, breathe. The wind tore tears from his eyes and pasted them to his cheeks where they froze. His beard stiffened with rime. He kept his gaze low, focused on the small world of ice within 3 feet of his toes. Behind him, the shadow of the shack blurred and vanished. The world became noise and motion and white. He could have been walking in circles, step after step, over the same patch of lake. Panic clawed at his ribs. He shoved it down, counting under his breath like he used to do on long night drives to keep himself awake. 20 steps, 50, 100. Just a few degrees to the left when the wind shifted. His thighs burned. Sweat chilled between his shoulder blades. Once the world dropped out from under his right boot. The ice gave a sickening, spongy lurch, spiderweb cracks shooting out from the point of his heel. He threw his weight forward onto his other foot, arms windmilling. For a second, he was sure the whole sheet would go, that he'd plunge through into water so cold it would shut his heart off before he could even scream. The cracks shivered, then held. He didn't look back. He just widened his stance, tried to spread his weight more, and kept going. Minutes or hours later, time had lost meaning in the storm. He walked into something solid. His nose exploded with pain. He fell back on his ass, swearing, and reached out blindly. Fingers met metal, cold, familiar. The side of someone else's shack. He laughed then, a high, borderline hysterical sound that the wind immediately snatched away. He staggered around it, hand pressed to the wall, and within another 30 feet his boot hit the plowed rut of the access track. It might as well have been a paved highway for the relief that flooded him. Tracks meant direction. Direction meant shore. He followed the ruts with the dumb faith of a sleepwalker. When the vague, hulking shadow of his truck finally loomed out of the white, haloed in blown snow, his legs almost gave out. He clawed the door open with numbed hands, half fell into the driver's seat, and sat there, shaking while the engine coughed itself reluctantly to life. He didn't look back at the lake as he drove off. He couldn't have seen anything if he had. The storm ate his taillights, within meters. The rearview mirror showed nothing but white. But later, much later, lying in a hastily rented room 2 towns south with a thin comforter pulled up to his chin, he would swear he'd had the sense of something large and flat moving beneath the truck as he crawled up the access road. A pressure under the wheels, a directionless, blind attention. He never went back to White Hart. The shack stayed where it was, chained to screws in ice that would eventually melt and refreeze and, someday, melt without coming back. He told the man who'd sold it to him that it had blown over in the storm and was no good, and mailed him the remainder of what he owed in an envelope that came back returned to sender months later. The bait shop closed the following summer. The reservoir level dropped, rose, dropped again, each cycle erasing and revealing different scars on its banks. In the city, Caleb learned the sounds of pipes. Old buildings whispered differently than new ones. Copper had one voice, PVC another. At first he only noticed them because he was listening too hard for anything that wasn't them. He moved into a third-floor walk-up with radiators that clanked and a bathtub that gurgled a little too much when it drained. The first time he turned on the shower, rusty water coughed from the spout before clearing. He stared at the brownish swirl circling the drain, his heart climbing insistently into his throat. At night, when the traffic noise died and the fridge's compressor cycled off, the apartment had its own language. Clicks, settling creaks, the slap of pipes expanding with hot water then shrinking again. He told himself that's all it was. That's all it had to be. But some nights, lying awake, he'd hear something else tucked between the familiar notes. A soft, round tapping from beneath the tub. A slow exhale from the kitchen sink after he shut the tap off. Once the toilet bubbled twice in the dead of night with no flush. He tried chalking it up to aging infrastructure. He even called the super once, complaining about weird noises in the plumbing. The man had stomped around, banged on a few joints, declared everything fine, and left with a shrug. "These old buildings, they talk," he'd said. "You get used to it." Caleb did not get used to it. He stopped taking long baths. Showers were quick, eyes open, one ear cocked for anything that didn't belong. He poured boiling water down the tub drain once a week, as if he could scald whatever fanciful thing his mind had attached to the gurgles away. When his granddaughter came to visit in the spring 3 months after the lake, he found himself checking the tap in the guest bathroom twice before letting her brush her teeth alone, listening for any shift in the rush that might hint at a second presence in the pipes. She was 6, all elbows and questions and a gap where one of her front teeth had fallen out. "Grandpa, do you have any scary stories?" she asked one night, wriggling under the blanket on the pull-out couch. "Daddy tells lame ones." He opened his mouth, some generic ghost story on the tip of his tongue, the kind with creaky attics and friendly haunts that turned out to be the wind. Instead, he saw, clear as a frozen morning, the black mouths in the ice calling his name. He saw the ring, the boot, the way the shack had jumped under something's unseen fist, the way the recorder had spoken back to him in his own voice. "No," he said quietly, tucking the blanket in tighter around her shoulders. "No scary stories." She pouted, but only for a second. "Mom says you went fishing on a frozen lake," she said instead. "Were you lonely?" "A little," he admitted. "Did the fish talk to you?" She giggled. He thought of the holes, of the way the voices had overlapped, full of cold need. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile that didn't fit right on his face. "They did." "What did they say?" "That I should come home," he lied, "and that I shouldn't bring anyone back there." Satisfied with that answer, she closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing evened out. He sat there a long time, listening to the small, fragile sound of it, and to the steady drip behind the bathroom wall that wouldn't quite resolve itself into simple plumbing. In the years that followed, headlines about the valley started cropping up more often. Record-low reservoir levels revealing old structures. Drone footage of church steeples poking from the shallows like worn teeth. A local news segment about the ghost town under our feet, complete with a smiling host in a hard hat gesturing to cracked foundations. They treated it like a curiosity, a quirk, history made Instagram friendly. Nobody talked about what might still be under those roofs, about the people who hadn't had the luxury of rising with the water. Caleb watched those segments with the TV volume low and the faucet in the kitchen running, letting the everyday sound of water drown out the reporter's bright voice. Whenever they showed the drone dipping low over the half-submerged streets, he thought he could see, in the shadow between two collapsed houses, a flicker of movement that didn't match the waves. A hint of something white and reaching just below the surface, fingers feeling for cracks. He never set foot on a lake again. He avoided even ornamental ponds in city parks, giving them a wide berth as if they were open manholes. Friends asked if he missed fishing. He said his knees weren't up to the cold anymore, that he preferred warmer hobbies, board games, TV, anything far away from still black water. But every winter, usually on the very night when the temperature dipped low enough that he could see his breath in the alley outside, the pipes in his building would knock in a slow 3-beat pattern. Thump, thump, thump. Always 3, always between midnight and 2. It was too regular to be random, too patient to be coincidence. Once, 2 years after Whiteheart, he'd given in to a moment of fatalistic curiosity. He'd turned off every appliance again like he had that first week back, waited for the building to settle into its creaking, sighing sleep, and then stepped into the bathroom, bare feet on cold tile. He'd shut the door, cutting off even the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The only sound was his own breathing. Caleb. A whisper sighed up from the drain in the tub, so soft he felt it more than heard it. His name rode the thin plume of sewer smell that surfaced with it, familiar and hateful. He stared down at the metal grate, at the swirl of dark porcelain where water ran after showers. For a moment he saw the ice holes instead, black circles in white, calling his name in stereo. "What?" he whispered back before he could stop himself. Silence answered him at first, then almost kindly, "We found roads." Water somewhere in the building turned on, someone upstairs flushing, a washing machine kicking in. He imagined it rushing through pipes between walls, flowing over places where hairline cracks matched up with tiny voids, where old fittings had rusted through just enough to let a whisper pass. A long network of black, wet veins pulsing through concrete and brick. "You didn't help," another voice murmured, not accusingly, just stating fact. "We found other drivers, they don't steer as well." Images flickered behind his eyes. News stories he'd half-watched about sinkholes appearing in cities far from any mines, about bathtubs collapsing into crawl spaces, about people describing voices in their water heater right before it burst. Most were treated as oddities. Human interest pieces sandwiched between weather and sports. "You'll drown them," he said. "Only some," the drain whispered brightly. "And not for long. We don't need the meat, you know. Just the doors they leave." He swallowed, bile hot in the back of his throat. "Why are you telling me this?" "You were first," the youngest voice said. "First we talked to, first who listened, first who walked away." And that was the worst part. Somewhere behind the horror, behind the anger and fear and self-lie that he'd had no choice, was the knowledge that he had walked away. He'd gotten in his truck. He'd left the shack. He'd let the lake keep its dead. He'd saved himself and whatever version of his soul still fit inside his chest and had done nothing else. No warnings that would be believed. No fences around that reservoir. No sinkholes filled with concrete. Just one old trucker quietly refusing to turn on his tap all the way. He didn't answer the drain. He turned on the faucet instead, full blast, scalding hot, and let it run until the mirror fogged and his ears filled with the roar of water. Underneath it for a few seconds he thought he heard something, like laughter, not mocking, not cruel, just distant and busy. Years later, when his granddaughter asks him again about scary stories, he tells her one about a snowman that came to life in a supermarket freezer. She rolls her eyes and says that's not scary at all. He doesn't tell her about the real one, about the holes in the ice, about how when you drill into some lakes, you're not just looking for fish, you're giving whatever's been pushed down there a place to breathe. On particularly cold nights when the radiators groan and the toilet gurgles and a thin crack spreads along one corner of the bathroom ceiling where the plaster never quite sets right, he lies awake and listens. The knocking comes, right on schedule. 3 slow thumps, courteous as someone at a front door. Thump, thump, thump. He closes his eyes and imagines that under the street, under the sewers, under all the rock and rebar and forgotten infrastructure, there's still a valley. Still houses. Still a church. Still a main street. Only now the roofs aren't under a lake. The lake is under everything else. It's seeped into basements and utility corridors. It's licking at the edges of subway tunnels. It's pressing its cold, patient face against the bottoms of bathtubs, listening for names. He pretends for his granddaughter's sake that those knocks are just pipes, that the voices in the faucets are just air, that the world above will hold. But every time he passes a storm drain and hears under the normal rush of runoff the faintest suggestion of syllables, he remembers the way the ice holes said his name. And he knows that one winter, whether he's there to see it or not, at least one person somewhere will lean over still. Dark water and hear a whisper from below asking for a trade. And he knows they won't understand what they're agreeing to until it's much, much too late.